Welcome back, colleagues. We have had some discussion there about how far we can proceed, and we're content to proceed for the next hour or so to try and conclude the next section in front of us. So thank you very much for your cooperation. I now call Amendment 303 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, grouped with amendments as shown in the groupings. I remind members that there are preemptions in this group as set out in the groupings. Call the Cabinet Secretary to move Amendment 303 and speak to all the amendments in the group. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Convener. With the committee's forbearance, my speaking notes on this are quite long, but there are a number of amendments from a number of members in here, so my apologies in advance for that. But it's important I try and set out in detail the work on the amendments and how we're keen to work with members going forward. The measures that are set out in sections 15, 16 and 17 of the bill provide local authorities with the power to request certain data from landlords where the local authority considers this could provide them with relevant information in connection with their duties under Part 1 of the bill. These provisions support the local authority to undertake their function of assessing rent conditions in their area. Having heard the issues raised on this issue by stakeholders, we share the view that amendments are required at Stage 2 to further strengthen the data collection powers within the bill. And I'd like to thank all members who have brought forward amendments on this issue. We have given them very careful consideration, and I look forward to the discussion we are having today. However, we have brought through our own alternative set of amendments as the Government, which we think strike the correct balance, which allow for information to be collected in a practical but cost-effective way. In designing these amendments, we have given consideration to the Committee's Stage 1 report. This noted that local data will be vital to determining whether rent control areas are required, alongside the need for a national approach to data collection. Our groups of amendments will give Scottish Ministers powers to collect data from landlords that will facilitate partnership working and data sharing between local authorities and the Scottish Government. This will allow greater flexibility for national and local level data collection to be delivered in the most practical and most cost-effective fashion. Looking forward, we are committed to working closely with our local authority partners as they put the assessment process into operation. I've listened very closely to their concerns about the resource implications involved in the assessment process and collecting of information, and this has influenced what amendments we have brought forward. Our further engagement will include how Government can best support the collection of information needed for a robust assessment of rent conditions in all 32 areas. While we have concerns about the implications of some of the amendments that have come forward, it is clear that there is consensus across all parties on the need for robust data. In this spirit, I'd like to take this opportunity to invite members who have brought forward amendments on data to join our planned engagement with local authorities over the coming months, where we will begin to set out options and plans to put processes for local authority assessments into operation. This will allow members to fully understand the potential impacts on local authorities of some of the proposed amendments, with a view to working with local government partners and ourselves on any further amendments that may be needed ahead of Stage 3. On this issue in particular, Convener, my door remains open for further discussion with members. Turning to how we see this partnership approach being put into practice, the Scottish Government already publishes statistics and advertised rent levels by broad rental market area. We are also taking forward steps to supplement this to provide data at a local authority level, providing a solid starting point for the local authority assessment process and aiding our understanding of rent levels. All of this will be underpinned by guidance for local authorities, which we are committed to co-authoring alongside members of our local authority working group. This will ensure a consistent approach across Scotland that provides for local flexibility we all know will be crucial. Further Government amendments for this group include expanding the list of information which local authorities and Scottish Ministers can request from landlords regarding their property. We propose consequential amendments to sections 16 and 17 so that Scottish Ministers, as well as local authorities, can apply to the First Tier Tribunal for an order for up to £1,000 to be paid by a landlord who has failed to give information or has deliberately given false or misleading information. We also propose amendments to provide for information sharing and cooperation between local authorities and Scottish Ministers to assist the exercise of their respective rent control functions under the bill, and to provide ministers with the powers to publish aggregate statistics. Turning now to the detail of amendments relating to the potential to collect rental data through the Landlord Register. The Landlord Register does not currently operate as a register of properties. The information currently requested is in relation to a landlord's portfolio to assess compliance with legislative requirements. I have significant concerns around amendments which would commit us to change the function of the Landlord Register to collect rental data from every landlord. This would place significant additional legal obligations on landlords and present new obligations for local authorities as the operator of the Landlord Register. Moreover, the redevelopment of the register itself would likely come at considerable cost. I do recognise, though, that clear systems and processes will be required to facilitate the collection of data from landlords in the most efficient and cost-effective way, and this is something my officials would consider in partnership with local authorities. I consider that the measures included in the bill, along with Amendments 303 to 322 in Paul McClelland's name, will enable effective partnership working with local authorities. This will provide for the collection of the necessary data to support rent controls in a more practical and cost-effective way. Turning to the amendments in Paul McClelland's name, 303 and 304 allow ministers, in addition to local authorities, to request information from landlords and tenants. This will help facilitate effective partnership working between local authorities and the government, which will be crucial to ensuring we are collecting the right data in a practical and cost-effective way to support our long-term aspirations for rent control. 315 is a consequential amendment to reflect those changes. Amendments 305, 306 and 308 are technical amendments to ensure that if part of the house is subject to a tenancy or occupancy arrangement, information can be sought about each tenancy or occupancy arrangement. 307 allows for the collection of information about the frequency of rent payable. 309 sets out that the rent payable includes payment of any costs associated with the house, and if it does, the amount of each such cost and the matter to which it relates, as understanding whether the rent is inclusive of any bills, such as council tax and utilities, is relevant to the rental value. 310 allows for the collection of information about the date of the most recent rent increase and the amount and frequency of the rent payable immediately before that rent increase took effect. 311 allows for information on the number of bedrooms, public rooms, kitchens, bathrooms and other rooms to be requested. 312 allows for the information on whether the house or part of it is fully furnished, partly furnished or unfurnished by the landlord. 313 allows for information on whether the house or part of it is subject to a subtenancy or other occupancy arrangement where the landlord is someone other than the person registered on the Landlord Register. Collectively, this information will help build a picture of the rent charged for different types of property, supporting the assessment of rent conditions in local authority areas. Amendment 314 provides that only one request can be made by a local authority or the Scottish Ministers for the same information from the same person in one 12-month period. This is to protect landlords from duplication. 316 to 318 make changes to section 15 of the bill to clarify the purpose for which information may be requested by a local authority or Scottish Ministers and the frequency of requests. These amendments ensure that information may be collected out with the local authority assessment and reporting cycles, as this being necessary to robustly analyse trends in rental data. Certainly.
Thanks. It's really just a question about 314, if I may. Sorry, I didn't quite get to you. It's about only one request in a 12-month period. Would that be a request? And then once information has been provided, my concern with that is if information is not forthcoming or only partial information is provided, surely the local authority should be able to go back to the landlord and say, you know, where's this missing information? We need more.
I absolutely do take the point that Maggie Chapman has raised. That's not the intent behind the amendment, to prevent some of the work that she has discussed there. And I will make sure that I look at that in relation to the work we go forward in stage 3 to see if there are any unintended consequences. But the intent of that amendment is to avoid duplication, to save landlords unnecessary bureaucracy. It's not to give a way out should any person try to find one. But I will come back to the member on that in the build-up to stage 3 to make sure that there are no issues there.
Thank you.
Amendment 319 will amend section 15 of the bill to provide definitions of the terms used in these amendments. And amendments 320 and 321 are consequential amendments to reflect the new arrangements for information requests made by the Scottish Ministers. Amendment 322 would provide the Scottish Ministers with a power to modify section 15 to change the information that may be sought by a local authority or the Scottish Ministers. This will provide flexibility to adapt the data collected to suit changing circumstances should existing information no longer be necessary or should new information be required. Amendment 394 would subject these regulations to affirmative procedures. 323 would allow for information sharing between local authorities and Scottish Ministers and between individual local authorities. This amendment clarifies the purpose for which information can be shared and seeks to minimise the number of requests made of landlords. Amendments 324 and 325 would remove and replace sections 16 and 17 of the bill, which currently provide enforcement mechanisms for a local authority where a landlord fails to comply with a request for information or knowingly provides false information in response to a request. The replacement sections provided by these amendments take account of the new powers to request information being conferred on Scottish Ministers. Amendment 326 would provide the Scottish Ministers with a power to request information held in a local authority's landlord register to enable them to carry out their functions and to assist local authorities in carrying out their functions under Part 1 of the Bill. Contact information for landlords and letting agents will allow the Scottish Ministers to collect data as allowed for by the amendments I have lodged. Amendment 328 would enable the Scottish Ministers to use the data collected to conduct research, public statistics or encourage others to do these things. This amendment will enable the processing of the information received from the landlords so that anonymised statistics can be published. This will, I hope, reassure Megan Gallagher, Edward Mountain and Carol Mochan in respect of their amendments in relation to making data publicly available. The collection of information from landlords is critical to the implementation of rent control. These amendments in my name will strengthen the ability to collect the relevant information from landlords, assisting local authorities undertaking their assessments of conditions in relation to rent and reaching a recommendation on whether rent control is appropriate. Turning to other amendments in this group. Amendments 3 to 6 and 8 in the name of Emma Roddick, alongside her consequential amendments 7, 9 to 20, would make it a duty for all landlords, almost 250,000, to provide all the information listed in section 15(2) of the bill within 28 days of being entered into the local authority's landlord register, and thereafter at such frequency as the local authority may determine. These amendments would allow any local authority to request any further information and would remove the purpose for which such information can be requested. These amendments would place a significant administrative burden on local authorities and landlords to respectively collect and provide data. They would also remove the discretion of local authorities to seek the data it deems necessary in the context of the local circumstances in their area.
You've touched on the consistency of data, and I think that's vitally important. But you've also touched on the practicalities within some of these amendments as to how local authorities could manage or even cope with some of the extra work that's required to even manage that process. So I think that the comments you made already, I'm encouraged by some of that, because I do think the extra burden that's going to be put on local authorities in this whole process would ensure that the information that would be received may not be as consistent as you'd expect under that circumstance.
I thank you for that intervention. I think we do have to look at the practicalities of it, and the intention of the amendments that I've came forward with today are to ensure that we have a robust set of data to allow rent control to function effectively and efficiently, regardless of whether members agree or not in rent controls. If the bill is passed, we do need this to work effectively and efficiently. So we need to collect enough data for that to be robust. But there is also a requirement on us to ensure that we are having a value for money and a cognizance of the impact on individual landlords on this as well, because we do not want to put landlords off entering or staying in the private rented sector. Certainly.
Thank you. I wanted to ask there, if a local authority can request this information from a landlord at any time, and that landlord then has 28 days to respond and give that information, why is that not onerous, but it is to make it clear to all landlords that once they register, they will be expected to give this data?
I thank Roddick for that intervention and for all the work that she has done in this area. I'm very keen to make sure that we have this balance correct, as I've just mentioned to Alexander Stewart. I'm very, very keen that local authorities have the powers in front of them to be able to collect the data to ensure this legislation works effectively. I take the member's point that she still, I think, has concerns that there are gaps and that it's not robust enough. But that's exactly why I made that invitation at the start of my opening remarks to ensure that if, regardless of where we end up with the discussion and the amendments voted on today and this week, if there remain concerns, then we can have those discussions about ensuring that we have robust data and a system that works effectively. So I do take the member's point, and I recognise she remains concerned on that issue. It is perhaps something that we can certainly pick up in those discussions with local authorities over the summer. If I may, Convener, to move on, I would like to thank Roddick for bringing forward these amendments, and as I say, particularly really appreciate the concerns that her amendments are based on. But I do have my own concerns around the proportionality of these amendments and the resource burden it would place on local authorities on collecting the information from landlords, and for that to be done on an ongoing basis. So I can't support, but I would hope that I can work with Emma Roddick and indeed local authority colleagues over the summer to discuss those issues. Amendment 109 in the name of Megan Gallagher would require Scottish ministers to publish information collected under Section 15 of the Bill. And I recognise the usefulness of making data available, and I have brought forward Amendment 328 to support the publication of information. However, I do not consider that it is necessary or cost-effective to publish each individual piece of information collected, and I cannot support Megan Gallagher's amendment, but that does go back to the principle of ensuring that we are not creating an overly complex or too bureaucratic system that does not deliver value for money. Yeah.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for giving me on that point, and I think this has been, again, really helpful, because we do know that there hasn't been enough data published in the past, if at all, on these areas, and I think we need to make sure that that data is not just available for MSPs to scrutinise, but certainly within the public domain as well, so people do have that full transparency in terms of what the market's saying and what information is being collected by local government. Certainly, if there is an opportunity to be part of the meeting with local government colleagues, I would certainly be interested in that. But I would like to ask the Cabinet Secretary, that through a simplified system, if we can, as soon as possible, get a feel in terms of what that's going to look like. Because again, so often we talk about the sort of high-level things here in Parliament, but actually, as Alexander Stewart and others have said, it's local authorities that have got to administer that, and we don't want to put that burden onto colleagues who might not have the resource to do it.
I think that's a very useful point that Megan Gallagher's made there, both in terms of what can and should be in the public domain, because it's important that with the information and the data being collected, we do open that up. That's why the amendments have been forwarded by the government, and I would look forward to her taking part in the discussions over the summer to exactly make sure that we are again testing this. And the importance for me is being able to test this before stage 3. So if there remain concerns, members with those concerns can come back, either whether they think the system doesn't collect enough information or if they think it collects too much information and it's overly cumbersome, then we can have that discussion and members have that ability to come back at stage 3 should they wish to do so. Convener, Amendments 137 in the name of Emma Roddick and Amendment 237 in the name of Maggie Chapman would increase the potential financial penalty on landlords for failure to comply with requests for information from £1,000 to £10,000. My amendments 324 and 325 would remove and replace sections 16 and 17 of the bill as a result of information gathering powers being conferred on the Scottish Ministers by amendments in this group. Maggie Chapman's amendments 324A and 325A similarly seek to increase this penalty to £10,000. Unfortunately, I can't support these amendments as I consider that this would set a penalty that is too high in the context of a landlord's conduct, and that I would still believe that £1,000 represents a more proportionate penalty. On this basis, I ask the members not to press and work with me ahead of stage 3 if they still have concerns on this issue. But the work that has been ongoing from the government around that level of penalty notice at this point, I remain convinced that we have the right level there. Amendments 153 to 155 in the name of Edward Mountain seek to make changes to the type of information that can be sought from landlords. Now, I understand the purpose of these amendments, but I consider the amendments 305 to 313 in Paul McClelland's name provide a more comprehensive expansion of the list of information that can be requested from a landlord. The list brought forward in amendments 305 to 313 is more consistent with information collected by Rent Service Scotland to support decisions on rent adjudication. I believe amendments 305 to 313 are more appropriate in the context of the information needed to support rent control, as they will deliver information more closely comparable to the data Rent Service Scotland currently collect on advertised rents. Amendments 156 and 157 in the name of Edward Mountain would mean that the information requested by local authorities would be added to the landlord register. The primary purpose of landlord registration is to give councils a means to assess whether an individual is a fit and proper person to let property. I do not believe adding this information to the landlord register will assist local authorities in making this assessment. These amendments could result in inconsistent information being held on different landlords, depending on whether a landlord has received a request for information or not. These amendments would also require further consequential amendments to the Antisocial Behaviour Scotland Act 2004. Whilst I acknowledge the intent behind these amendments and recognise there could be benefits to using the landlord register as part of the data collection process, it is important to emphasise that these changes would place significant additional burdens on landlords and local authorities as the operator of the landlord register. I do not consider they are necessary in connection with rent control and could inadvertently make a fundamental change to the purpose of the landlord register without due consideration of the impact on its core purpose, that is, ensuring someone is a fit and proper person to be a landlord. I cannot therefore support the amendments. Amendment 448 in the name of Maggie Chapman would amend the bill to change the discretion of a local authority to a duty, meaning that every local authority in Scotland would need to write to every landlord on the register requesting all the information set out in section 15(2) of the bill. As I previously set out, while I understand and support the real desire for robust information about tenancies, I cannot support this amendment. It would remove the discretion of local authorities to seek the data it deems necessary and would be costly and disproportionate to the level of data needed to inform rent control assessments. Amendments 449 and 450 in the name of Maggie Chapman would provide for data to be obtained from landlords for the purposes of being provided to the rent officer or the first tier tribunal to assist them in determining open market rent. It is not clear that this information is needed by rent officers or the first tier tribunal, as they already make determinations of open market rent without access to that information. It is also uncertain how such a process is intended to operate or how often information would be needed for this purpose. This would place an additional burden on local authorities with potentially significant costs and no clear benefit, and I am unable to support these amendments. Amendment 481 in the name of Carol Mochan would require local authorities to provide a copy of the information they have obtained from a landlord to the tenant. While I recognise the intent behind this amendment, it would add a significant additional administrative burden and cost in relation to the collection of data. Given the concern here is about the accuracy of the information being provided by the landlord, there are already powers in the bill for local authorities to request information from tenants, and I therefore cannot support the amendment as I do not believe it is needed. Amendment 482, also in the name of Carol Mochan, would remove the Scottish Minister's ability to remove information from the list of information that can be requested from a landlord. This would remove the flexibility that the power was intended to create, and it would mean that primary legislation would be required to remove any information from that list which was no longer considered relevant. Regulations under section 15(7) are subject to affirmative procedure, so there would be parliamentary scrutiny of any attempt to reduce the information that can be requested, and I therefore cannot support this amendment. Finally, turning to Carol Mochan's amendments 483 to 486, these would amend sections 16 and 17 of the bill to remove elements of discretion from the enforcement procedures behind the duties on landlords to provide information. These amendments would remove an element of discretion from local authorities and in certain cases would create strict liability for a financial penalty, even where the first-tier tribunal considered such a penalty to be inappropriate. I therefore cannot support these amendments. Sections 15, 16 and 17 of the bill were drafted with the intention of ensuring that the powers for local authorities and Scottish ministers support the collection of data on a proportionate basis and do not unnecessarily burden local authorities, landlords and tenants. My amendments in this group seek to enhance those powers while respecting the rights of landlords. In conclusion, Convener, whilst I understand the intent behind the amendments in this group, I cannot support them for the reasons I have set out, and I would therefore urge Emma Roddick, Maddie Chapman, Edward Mountain, Carol Mochan and Megan Gallagher not to press their amendments in this group and to work with me ahead of stage 3. If any of their amendments are pressed, I would ask members to oppose them and instead to support the amendments brought forward in the name of Paul McClellan, and I move Amendment 303.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, for that. And you've moved it. Would you move that? Yep, thanks. I will now invite Emma Roddick to speak to Amendment 3 and other amendments in the group. Emma.
Thank you, Convener. Most of my amendments in this group aim to require data that the bill currently allows local authorities to request. So amendments 3, 4, 6, 7 and 10 to 20 make the change at various points where there are references to a local authority being able to request data to requiring that data be provided. Amendment 8 allows local authorities to make changes to the information that landlord must provide and ask landlords for information beyond what's listed in the bill and in line with Minister's guidance. I feel that this is important to allow local context to be taken into account. Amendments 5 and 9 change the 28-day limit for providing data from being asked for it by a local authority to a 28-day limit from entering the landlord register and allow the local authority to refer to a first-tier tribunal when this is not met. I also feel this is important in terms of allowing that certainty that has been discussed around landlords and making it very clear what the expectations are when somebody takes up this role. Amendment 137 ensures the penalty for a landlord not providing information is increased from £1,000 to £10,000. I lodged this amendment because £1,000, especially when it is a small part of a set monthly rent, may just be seen as a fee worth paying for getting out of providing other information. Refusing to provide what is agreed as reasonable information should incur a higher fine. I believe it's entirely reasonable to make use of existing processes to ensure that we have sight of rent levels and other information that councils are being allowed to nag landlords for already. The government's amendments are progress, but they don't provide for that cross-cutting data on current rent levels. The lack of data on current rents and the complexity of trying to tie together what we do have and government justifying policy progress through data that was scraped from Zoopla can make even the best policy impossible to implement well or even at all. And that's long been a sincere frustration to me. And I brought these amendments from a place of wanting to fill those gaps and bring truth to future debates on the private rented sector. because we don't need to be sitting arguing with each other, as we often do in this committee, about whether anecdotes from whichever side they're brought are representative of a wider situation. And we don't need to wonder whether rent levels set for those who've been in situ for a long time are below or above or at market rate. Allowing local authorities to request data piece by piece will never give us a broad view. And even if local authorities do make use of that power regularly, they will be building a skewed picture because they're asking these landlords for a reason. We still will not know what is happening in rentals that are generally unproblematic and not changing hands. Now, this impacts everything from evidence bases for bringing in rent controls to the very definition of market value. And in my time on this committee, I've heard a broad range of witnesses speak to the urgency and necessity of better data. We've had Citizens Advice Scotland say that we need better data collection for policy making. Generation Rent say without good local level rent data, it's hard to know what effect the measures that the Scottish Government has already brought in is having on the local market. Scottish Land and Estates absolutely agree that good data underpins good legislation and want to be in a position where data underpinning the bill is as clear as possible for both landlords and tenants. We got very interesting evidence from Robin Blacklock, who said that rent pressure zones did not work because we did not collect the data. So if we do nothing else under the bill but set up data collection, it will be a success. So it's clear to me that better data collection is vital. It's sensible. It will uncover those situations which the likes of Scottish Land and Estates want attention on, those landlords that we hear about who haven't that effort put in to protect their long-term rural residents, haven't raised rent controls or considerably over many years, and it will prove or disprove exorbitant rent levels as well. So allowing us to review the impact of this legislation and ensure future changes to policy are reactive and appropriate, we need to be relying on strong data. And I appreciate that some stakeholders have come back outlining cost issues with my suggested approach, although remaining supportive of the idea in principle. And I want to be clear that I'm not dead set on this being collected by the local authority for all of it to be standard or what set interval to use. I don't want to make things harder for the local authorities or for landlords, but I do think we need the data on what current rent levels are. I'm glad to hear about the summer engagement and happy to take part. I would be happy to look again at these amendments on the basis that we are working to introduce something at stage 3 that will allow a more cross-cutting view of rent levels. But I will bring something back at stage 3 if the government does not. I'm disappointed that initially positive discussions with the Minister have not resulted in the progress that I hoped for, and I don't consider that the government's amendments today go far enough because they cannot tell us what current rent levels are, and we should know that. Now, as I said, Robin Blacklock told this committee that if we do nothing else but collect better data, then this bill will be a success. I want this bill to be a success, so let's make it a success, build a solid evidence base and stop guessing. Thank you.
Thank you, Emma. I now call Maggie Chapman to speak to Amendment 448 and other amendments in the group. Maggie.
Thanks very much, Convener. I've got a number of amendments in this group on two main issues. Some are preempted, and we'll come to how that washes out in a moment. But I'll begin by thanking Emma Roddick for her comments. I agree with the points she has made in her remarks, and my amendments address very similar issues, sometimes exactly the same issue as what Emma Roddick has sought to address. Firstly, the issue of rent levels and what they actually mean or represent. My amendments 448, 449, and 450 address a technical but important issue. Current challenges to rent increases are based on open market rent, as understood through advertised rent, not actual rents being paid. Since the majority of advertised rents are set at the maximum the market will bear, open market comparison always pulls rents upwards. So a real rent comparison would act as a stabiliser, and 448 to 550 move us towards this. That means, but as Emma Roddick has outlined, we need to collect that data. We need that data in a clear and coherent and comparable place across the country. The Cabinet Secretary in her remarks indicated that she wasn't clear about the benefit of the measures, particularly in 449 and 450. The benefit is just that, to allow rent officers to have real rent info, not some mythical advertised or guesswork information. Actually having that information that renters are experiencing, that landlords are charging. With that accurate information, we can have a much clearer sense of what's actually going on, because we don't have that at the moment. The next bunch of amendments, 237, 324A and 325A, raise the £1,000 fines for non-provision of information and provision of false information to £10,000, both in the original and proposed new sections of the bill. This underlines the importance of getting the necessary and correct information. And it's also was an issue highlighted in the stage 1 evidence gathering by the committee, where they identified what made rent pressure zones unworkable was not having the information in the right form, in the right place, as Emma Roddick has already outlined. We cannot be in a situation where the fines imposed are treated by some landlords as just the cost of doing business. If they get found out, they'll be fined, but they incorporate those fines into their expected costs. The fines must be real incentives to act properly and appropriately and provide the information required when required. That is why I believe, and I think others around the table agree, that that level of £1,000 is just too low. It doesn't incentivise appropriate and proper behaviour. The Scottish Government has a large number of amendments in this group, and I support most of these. Overall, though, rent controls will only work when local councils have the necessary information on rents and the other aspects of the properties, and the government amendments do seek to provide for that information. I support Emma Roddick's amendments and the intention behind them to shift the burden of providing information onto landlords by requiring them to do so as soon after registering as a landlord as possible, rather than waiting to be asked for the provision of that information. Carol Mochan's provision for the information provided by landlords to be sent on to the tenants who can challenge its accuracy and perhaps provide additional information is also really, really welcome. Overall, I think this section is really, really important. If we're wanting to ensure that we have accurate and appropriate information, we need to support the mechanisms for the collection of that information, and we need to have appropriate penalties for when that information is not provided or when it is provided falsely or inaccurately. So overall, I think there's a lot of really, really positive work in this section. I take on board the Cabinet Secretary's offer and suggestion of ongoing conversations, and I'd be very pleased to engage with her on that basis in advance of stage 3. Like Emma Roddick, though, if we don't get to where I think we need to on these, if we don't get as far as we need to go, I will seek to bring back these amendments at stage 3. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. Can I now call Megan Gallagher on behalf of Edward Mountain to speak to Amendment 153 and other amendments in the group. Megan.
Thank you, Convener. In the interest of time, if I may speak to Edward's amendments, and then I'll speak to my own amendment 109 as well, if that is okay. To look firstly at my colleague Edward Mountain's amendments 153, again is regarding information gathering. We've had quite a long discussion regarding this already, and the Cabinet Secretary, of course, has outlined her reasonings for not supporting these amendments at this stage due to a wider conversation that will happen in due course. But 153, just for the interests of those who have been following today's proceedings, 153 is information to include information sought by local authorities, for example, the number of bathrooms in the house, and then 154 similarly would be for the floor area of the house. Again, it's making sure that we are obtaining more information, more data that is relevant to rental properties, and of course relevant to those who will be renting those properties as well. 155 is regarding information collected by local authorities should include quality of property, required repairs and the EPC energy and efficiency rating as well. And I've mentioned EPCs of course in earlier contributions. I think this will be actually quite an important amendment once we know more about the EPC review, and I'm hoping that that can be teased out as part of the conversation that we'll have over the summer months, because again, you know, EPC compliance has been an area of interest not just for the government but certainly for committees who have been looking and covering those pieces of work as well. Moving on to 156 and 157 in the name of Edward Mountain. 156 again going back to information collection, using the the authority's landlord register. Again, this was an alternate means that we can gather data to make sure that data is accessible, usable, but also collected in the appropriate manner. I understand that the Cabinet Secretary has outlined her reasonings for not supporting these amendments. However, I do believe that we should look more widely at the landlord register, perhaps how it's used in ways that we can do things differently to improve the overall aims of this section of the bill. And finally, if I could turn to my Amendment 109, which I will not be moving today following the discussions that have already taken place. I do believe that data is crucial to this bill, and I want to emphasise that point today. Whatever we do moving forward, we know that we're not in as good a place in terms of scrutinising these particular areas of legislation because we don't have that data readily available. But again, I take on board the issue in terms of local government resourcing, how that's going to be put in place should certain amendments be voted for and agreed to today or at stage 3. And we do need to be mindful, of course, that in a time where local authority funding has depleted, particularly in recent years, that we're not putting more financial pressures on them to try and achieve something that they might not be able to achieve themselves. So I think we need to look at this in the round. Again, I don't necessarily believe we'll get the exact steer of direction today, but I do welcome the comments that have come from both the Cabinet Secretary and other colleagues in this area. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. And I now invite Carol Mochan to speak to Amendment 481 and other amendments in that group. Carol.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to speak to the amendments lodged in my name. The amendments all seek to strengthen the capacity of local authorities to assess rent conditions in their area. I've listened carefully to the debate so far, and I think we have some common purpose in terms of the importance of data. The purpose of Amendment 481 is to recognise that tenants are essential to verifying the accuracy of information provided by a landlord to local authorities. This amendment requires local authorities to share information submitted by landlords with their tenants registered at the address. This will create a standardised process where the tenants have the option to report information which they think may be false or incorrect in their landlord's submission. Landlords are required by law to inform tenants of any rent changes. Therefore, tenants are the only party able to verify this information. Whilst I appreciate this provision would add to the administrative burden faced by local authorities, the bill places a duty on local authorities to investigate false information, and the only way to enforce this is with the participation of the tenant. Amendment 481 therefore gives purpose to this part of the bill. Amendment 482 recognises that a well-regulated rented sector will be reliant on consistent information. Amendment 482 therefore places a duty on Scottish ministers to maintain the minimum categories of information which local authorities must report on and not reduce these. Each is essential to the understanding rent increases against types of tenure and property. In future, the range of information sought might be expanded but never reduced beyond the original categories. The amendment will safeguard consistency so that geographic areas are not being evaluated by different criteria. And I have taken notes of the Minister's points on those, and I hope that we'll be able to discuss that further, as I say, over the summer, as others have said. Amendment 483 to 486 create standardised sets of notices that can be issued by a local authority where a landlord either fails to provide or provides false information. The intention is to ensure the integrity of data collection by encouraging the responsibility of landlords to report accurately. Specifically, Amendments 483 and 484 instruct a local authority to initiate proceedings if a landlord does not provide any information when requested. There is also a duty to re-seek missing information and initiate a recurring penalty fine until the information has been submitted. Specifically, Amendment 485 and 486 create a similar mandatory requirement for local authority to initiate first-tier tribunal proceedings in the circumstances that information provided is suspected to be false. I think we can agree that the accuracy of data is so important, and so that's why I think it is important that some of these are seen in the final form within the bill. But given what the Cabinet Secretary has said, I intend to seek a discussion as has been offered.
Thank you, Carol. There are no other members indicating they wish to speak, so I would ask the Cabinet Secretary now to wind up. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Convener. I think that's been a really useful discussion, once again bringing to light the real necessity for robust data and indeed the requirement for that to allow this legislation to be effective. And I thank members for bringing forward both the amendments and the discussions we've had today. A number of members have suggested that they would be interested in the discussions and the meetings that will happen over the summer. So to Carol Mochan, to Maggie Chapman, Megan Gallagher and Emma Roddick, and indeed anyone else who I've forgotten about, that invite is absolutely there, and I thank them for their continuing interest in that. I've clearly heard once again today that despite the government coming forward with a number of amendments, because we listened to the concerns that were in the stage 1 report from committee, there are still concerns out there, and I think it's important that we have those further detailed discussions, and we do so in a way that can bring in local government colleagues and indeed the views of landlords. Convener. We all, I think, seem to be in collective agreement that we want this to work, both for the tenants and for the councils and for landlords. So to ensure that we have robust data in a cost-effective manner, recognising the burdens that we will be placing on landlords, and that will be an area which I will continue to have focus on over the summer. On a couple of points of detail, we are already moving to collect more data on advertised rents at local authority level, as I mentioned earlier, and the powers that we've proposed and the amendments that are here today will allow the government to supplement this with information about in-tenancy rents, and it's important that we engage with local authorities and, as I said, the members there as we move through the practicalities of that, because members are quite right to point out to rents being required not only as advertised but also as a tenancy is continuing. On the issue around the level of fines, the maximum penalty of £1,000 is in line with level 3 of the Offences, Penalties and Powers of Enforcement guidance, and is the normal maximum penalty for obstructing a person performing a statutory duty, and that's why that level has been designated within the bill, and is what the government is proposing. If that detail and that reasoning still has concerns ringing with members, then again I'm happy to continue those discussions, but that was the basis for that £1,000. But I'll leave it there, Convener, and look forward to the discussions members wish to do so.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Cabinet Secretary. Could I finally remind members that if Amendment 303 is agreed to, I cannot call Amendments 3, 448, 4 and 5 due to preemption. And the final question today is that Amendment 303 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. Yes, we are. Thank you very much, colleagues. Thank you for that. At that point, colleagues, will draw proceedings of the committee to a close as previously agreed. And I would like to thank the Cabinet Secretary and your officials for your attendance. And that concludes the public part of our meeting today, and we will reconvene the Stage 2 consideration of the Housing Scotland Bill tomorrow. And as we decided to take our final item on the agenda in private, I now close the public part of this meeting. Thank you very much. Thank you.